So I wanted to do some work to carry us over from our last voice thread discussion into what we are starting to talk about with Preface to Plato. Before I kind of sort of talk a little bit more about the sort of content-based kinds of things, I wanted to say more about VoiceThread itself. So we had a really interesting question about VoiceThread in our course questions forum, and I thought it was actually, I was like, wow, it's so pertinent to what we're talking about, because in some sense the question was, well, like, how long should the post be, and when should we be using sort of like text, and when should we be using audio? I find this to be a really interesting question because it really only happens in this context of trying to do kind of like a more rich discussion. But then, of course, it's like translated from the kinds of things that might happen if we were all sitting together at the same time in a classroom into this online discussion environment. And when we're all sitting together in a classroom, you know, people are much more sensitive to like the sense that like, you know, you don't, like they're just sort of like much more obvious kind of starting and stopping points. And we can see the faces and the expressions of the people that are around us, and we're like really sensitive to what's happening there. So even if you're just kind of expressing a point in like sort of a face-to-face class, there's still this really important sense in which you are like expressing to, and you're really conscious of the fact that you're addressing a very specific set of people. That's obviously a lot harder to do in an online environment, right? Like, even if like you know that like there's like a set number of students in the class, and like you've kind of gotten to look at everybody's selfies and get a sense of who they are, you know, we're just not attuned to addressing people or having conversations in these ways. And so we have to do a lot more sort of like mental work to think about how to have these kinds of conversations online, especially using VoiceThread. I do think that one of the things that's really helpful about it is really in your head to try to think about VoiceThread as much more like an in-class discussion than writing discussion posts inside D2L. My experience has been that when we're writing in D2L, we tend to give a lot more background and context. Sometimes people even use citations. You know, it's really a sort of textual medium where you can provide a lot of information and people can kind of skim it as necessary or kind of go through. And it still works like relatively well. But you can imagine what it would be like if we were, you know, like in a VoiceThread discussion and someone was, you know, somebody like went through the citation, right? Like, it's just such a different platform. So I think as you're engaging in VoiceThread and you're trying to think about how to wrap your head around like, all right, well, what do I do? Try to think about it as addressing sort of specific points and keeping your keeping the length of what you say kind of shorter than you might. You know, there's like nothing's gonna cut you off, right? There's not gonna be like red flashing lights. And I often, you know, I don't discourage students from, if you have a long thing to say, I think you should say it. But I do think that it's also important to keep in mind that like, well, yeah, but like, you know, we're all listening to the voice threads, and so we want to make sure that we're being intentional and purposeful with the way that we use the voice thread activity, and making sure that we're thinking about it also from the perspective of what it's like to listen to. Because I really do want the voice threads to be something that we are able to listen to over time. Having said that, part of the reason I do these recap videos is because I know how difficult it is to listen to every single comment on the voice threads. And so I try to use these kinds of recap videos as a way of highlighting different kinds of points and addressing different questions. So I'm trying to find a balance between wanting our voice threads discussions to be as much like a face-to-face classroom environment as possible, and also just recognizing the limitations of the platform, or maybe it's not even the limitations of the platform, like maybe it's the limitations of our psychology. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, and I think as long as everyone's kind of being intentional, it should work out pretty well, and I can sort of, you know, I'll be talking to people individually, or, you know, like sort of, you know, like off voice thread, like via email, about sometimes things that they say, and so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Like I wouldn't have a lot of anxiety that you're going to get a bad grade because you talked too much or you didn't talk enough on VoiceThread. That's not something that I expect to be an issue at all. It is actually a very interesting way to sort of lead into our discussion about sort of carrying over Marshall McLuhan. And what I actually wanted to talk about, I think most, I was sort of going back and forth thinking about like how much I wanted to say about different kind of issues. And I think I just want to focus on this idea of two things. I want to talk about the distinction between hot and cold media, because I think this is something that kind of hangs Marshall McLuhan's ideas together. And then I also kind of want to use that sort of as a sort of segue into talking about Plato on poetry and thinking about the experiences of different kinds of media. So when Marshall, I mean, I actually think that one of the best comments was from Don, and he was talking about, he said, like, Marshall McLuhan in another book has this point that we shape our tools and our tools shape us. And I think that is actually this really great kind of pithy encapsulation of what Marshall McLuhan's ideas are. I think it's kind of harder to work out in practice, sort of like the details of that. Like Marshall McLuhan himself said that at some point. And like when you try to get into the nitty gritty, it doesn't necessarily hang together as with many of the things that McLuhan says. But I think I in some sense, like in some sort of like really just intuitive, not exactly surface level, but really kind of just like this, there's a way in which it makes, for the most part, a lot of sense about how we engage with different kinds of media. And then we can think about sort of like different kinds of rare cases, but it's a really good general way of capturing the idea at hand. For Marshall McLuhan, hot media is something that extends one of our senses. So, right, it's like this idea that we have one of our senses kind of on steroids. So radio is a hot media, right? Because you have to basically just listen to it, but you're reading in a lot to the audio. So in order to like kind of get the experience of radio, you have to be relying a lot on your ability to hear. A photograph is also a kind of hot media because, and it's not clear to me that a selfie is, though, as we'll talk about, but a photograph, just like a plain photograph, is a kind of hot media because it's kind of this just like visual documentation of an event. And so it highlights our visual sense, but of course it's just our visual sense, right? Like you can't hear what's happening in a picture. You're not in the moment in that way. And so it's really kind of extending one of our senses in, it's like, our senses on steroid. So hot medias and like hot media or hot mediums and hot media are something that kind of involves the extension of like one particular sense. So print, he thinks, is like this because he thinks that we're really involved in both just kind of like this sort of like we're reading. And I think Marshall McLuhan actually thinks of, in some sense, the practice of reading as being kind of a subset of our visual sense, but it's so important to the way that we interpret the world that he thinks of that as like a very different kind of sense. So it's not just, he doesn't think of reading as being entirely analogous to language, because of course when we talk with each other, there's so much else that's going on, as opposed to when we read, we have to kind of insert all of that into a particular medium, right? So it's like compacted is maybe the right way to think about hot mediums, is that they're dense, right? Like everything gets smooshed together and that all of the information is conveyed to you through one of your primary senses. So cool media would be something that's more, so like he actually gives at one point the example of a cartoon as a kind of cool media. And the reason there being that, like, if you've noticed, like, different kinds of cartoons, they're rarely, like, very, I mean, it's not like graphic novels are different, but this is, like, just, like, thinking about, like, a newspaper cartoon. They are not, like, really visually rich, right? They're sort of, like, kind of rough outlines, and And there's a lot of sort of subtle and contextual information that's conveyed in the cartoon that, like, decontextualized, you can sometimes look at a cartoon and just not get what it means, right? Because there are some cartoons that are sort of really carefully embedded within time and place and context. And so I think this is really something that he's getting at with this sense of hot mediums versus cool mediums, and what he like, sort of roughly the kinds of distinctions that he wants to draw. But what's really interesting about McLuhan is that in some sense, he doesn't think that there is anything innate about media itself exactly. He thinks that media is always consumed in a particular society or in a particular context, right? So I think that the actually thinking about poetry as the way it's sort of contrasted in sort of like Preface to Plato, and the way that we think of poetry is a really great example of this. So in some sense, you can talk about Homer's The Iliad, right? Like, you can say, like, Homer's The Iliad. Like, well, what is it? Well, it's a poem. It's content, right? It's, like, written down. But in Plato's time, in part just because of the, like, it was expensive, and, like, not everybody could read, even though poetry was written down as well, and in part because of, like, the cumbersomeness of scrolls, they were really difficult to store. Poetry was almost, like, even if it's something like the Iliad, which is, like, an epic poem, it was performed. You read it with other people. It was this really social event. And that's really different from the standard way, or the most typical way, that we consume poetry today. Like, today when we read poetry, we read poetry. It is most often the case that poetry is consumed by someone who is reading a piece of text alone, and they're reading it, they're not speaking it, right? They're reading it in their head. So you can still talk about, like, this medium of poetry, but the experience of poetry is so different in one context rather than another that you could think about it as being, so, it's very much kind of more in Plato's time, the way that he would consume poetry would be a cool medium, because it's performed, it's social, it's, like, happening in a particular place and time, so it's much more dramatic, like, it's contextual, it's more like a play, even though it's an epic poem. And when we read poetry, because it's like print and we're reading it quietly in our heads, it would be more like a cool medium. But in some sense, you can say, like, well, it's still all poetry. It's just that in these different contexts, given different groups of people, we're engaging with it really differently. And so there's not really anything like, right, he's talking about different kinds of things. So when we're saying like different mediums, it's really hard to say that there's something innate about any given medium, right? It's really hard to say that there's anything innate about innately hot about radio. What if the act of, like, listening to a podcast in a kind of like live tweeting a podcast, that's going to be more cool, right? But in some sense, right? So he's thinking about these broader effects and the way that different kinds of information are consumed. So this distinction between hot and cool media is kind of helpful for thinking about how we individually experience media and the ways in which they're sort of useful and what we have to do in order to make sense of the world through them. But there's not, they change and everything is really elastic. So I think that's why it's so helpful to think about Preface to Plato immediately following our discussion of Marshall McLuhan and trying to make sense of, like, what he's saying. He really is, I think, sort of helpful for kind of starting yourself, scratching your head and asking interesting questions. And then we sort of move on and think if we can find maybe perhaps more illuminating responses to those questions. But I do think that the practice of asking questions is very valuable.